Breaking news, Anish Giri has refuted chess. That's right. I'm taking a look today at a game between Anish Giri and Vladislav Kovalev, where Anish came up with some very interesting ideas in the Italian and might have given Black very, very serious problems that he'll need to consider. So why don't we just jump right in and take a look at the game. Of course, the Italian starts with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and we are deep in the Giuoco piano. c3 is White's choice, preparing to expand in the center. Knight f6 hits this pawn. White plays d3, defending well enough. d6, and now Anish plays bishop g5. And this is the move that kind of denotes like a sideline. Usually in the Giuoco piano, White has castled here historically, or played bishop b3, or knight bd2, or even, these days, some b4 stuff, gaining some space early on the queen's side. But Giri chooses not the most popular move, bishop g5, pinning this knight to the queen. Historically, Black has responded the way that Vladislav Kovalev responded in the game, with h6. After bishop h4, Black goes ahead and plays a6 as well now, just giving this bishop an extra square to tuck itself away on. White plays knight bd2, and now Black retreats this bishop before White has time to play d4 or b4, kicking it away. Here, White simply castles. Black castles as well. Now we see a4, and this is pretty typical these days of high-level Italian games. This a4 move is really gaining in popularity, and the idea is you want to gain some space on the queen's side. Historically, the Italian hasn't given White too much of an edge here, but with this new idea to start gaining some queenside space, it is proving a little bit more difficult for Black to solve all of his problems. And so we'll see here, Black played in a very common manner with g5. You'll also see sometimes they start with king h7, but g5 is quite common here. g5, pushing this bishop back. Note that knight takes g5 is actually a playable move here, but Giri chose a different line with bishop g3. Of course, the idea though with knight g5 is that you get a very nice pin on this knight and a lot of pressure with the white pieces, but bishop g3 is his choice instead. And now Black plays this move, king g7, and on the surface this position doesn't look too threatening for White here. It's not super clear what White intends to do, but after the next few moves, Giri actually had a pretty substantial advantage. And when I was going over this game, trying to prepare it for this lecture, or video, or game review, or news bulletin, I was finding it very difficult to find where Black's mistake was in this opening to get such a disadvantage. And it turns out, I think, this move king g7 is actually a little bit too slow. And we'll see why in just a moment here. Instead, perhaps Black should expand on the king side a little bit more quickly. He wants to play this move h5. To start with, though, he needs to defend his pawn on g5 with a move like knight h7. And perhaps after h3 and h5, this is the advantage in time he needs, not spending a tempo on king g7. You can compare this position to what happened in the game, so if b4, now there's an h4 move and a g4 move, and Black's play on the king side comes pretty quickly. But we'll compare it with what happens in the game here, where after king g7, White plays rook e1. This move supports the center, but more importantly, clears the f1 square for the knight. Now we see knight h7, the very similar idea. And after h5 and h3, h4, bishop h2, g4, the idea for Black is to expand further on the king side and use this bishop now to create an awkward pin on this knight on f3. But due to this wasted tempo, White's play actually comes very quickly. So the idea of White's play on the queen's side is he wants to actually play in the center, which isn't the most intuitive. But the reason White has been avoiding d4 is because this black knight controls the square quite effectively, and it's difficult to get enough support to push through. So first, white is pushing through on the queen side with this move b5, and takes is possible, but instead black simply plays knight e7. And now with the removal of this knight, d4 is in fact played here. And this is a pretty powerful idea, actually, from Giri. It's not so easy to meet all of the problems presented here by this push in the center. You could capture, white will simply capture back, and then if you dare to take on d4, this is where things get a little bit crazy. First, we'll take on a6. If you take my rook, I'll take back with check, and then take b7, so you should recapture here first. And now, white simply plays a move, queen c1, daring you to actually capture this exchange. Of course, the idea of queen c1 is to unpin, so you should take. The queen captures back. And now after f6, we're actually going to pick up this pawn as well. And this is going to be very, very dangerous for black. This is not something you really want to go into here. The two bishops are actually going to be quite powerful now, as well as this queen on the long open diagonal. The f5 square is available for the knight, and this king is going to be very, very loose. And this would be a ton of compensation for white here. So this d4 move actually just gets to stand on the board. And this is a huge problem for black. We'll see black continues with knight g6, trying to take advantage of this f4 square. But now we see b takes a6, b takes a6, and white simply continues with the very natural plan of knight f1. Now there's no ideas of capturing this pawn, because the queen simply defends. In fact, though, black does capture here, and after bishop takes f3, now we really don't actually want to give up this pawn, so we take back with the pawn. And now black kind of was led astray a bit. He thought he needed to break down this very, very strong center, which is a very natural thing to think. And so he played the committal move f5. But in fact, this move is pretty close to just losing. It weakens far too much, and Giri took advantage of it. Instead, though, I was looking here at first and trying to find an improvement for black, and it turns out this position is just very, very bad. This is not a good position for black at all. This center is far too strong, and this is why earlier on he needed to play a little bit more actively, a little more quickly. You see this move king g7 didn't really turn out to be useful. The idea, I think, is to bring a rook behind the king, but in fact, black never finds time to do this. White's play in the center comes too quickly. So this ended up just being a wasted tempo. And if you compare what happened in the game to what would have happened if he didn't waste this tempo on king g7, well, the difference is he has enough time to deal with this d4 push. And if d4 doesn't come, then black's position is totally fine, and in fact quite favorable due to the pressure along this knight on f3. So let this be a word of warning. Always be careful how you spend your tempi early on in the opening, because it could come back to haunt you, especially if you're playing Anish Giri. So perhaps some better tries would have been something like queen f6, or even king h8, stepping off of, a knight f5 check. Instead, though, black wanted to challenge the center with f5, but the fact is there's no real threat here. So simply knight e3, and after f takes, we see a queen g5 check. King h1 comes on the board, and rook takes f2 is played. And now this is a pretty complicated position, as you can probably imagine here. The black major pieces are invading just a little bit on this second rank here, and the knights seem to be very threateningly placed to come into play in just a moment here. But in fact, white has no problems. The best line is actually for white to play bishop g1, rook b2, and after queen c1 rather, this rook has no squares to run to on this second rank, so it must be defended. And now, after bishop b5, there's simply no way to defend this rook. It's a nice interference tactic here for white. Rook b3 is possible, but now this rook's problems continue with queen c2, or even a queen takes c7 with the idea of capturing this bishop. So this would have been totally winning for white. Instead, though, Giri did not find the most accurate way to play, instead choosing knight f5 check, which of course removes the protector of g2. So after king g8, or king h8 rather, white must play rook g1 to avoid getting checkmated. Black goes for rook takes h2 check, king takes h2, queen f4 check, king h3, knight g5 check, and of course these knights are too powerful, so white simply gives the exchange back with rook takes g5 and queen takes g5. Now aiming to trade off some of these pieces, Giri goes for queen g1. After another check, we do see the trade of queens. And here, this endgame is simply quite nice for white. The reason for that being, this king is very, very weak. You can imagine some checkmating threats actually appearing on the board. And this pawn is definitely going to fall. And in the meantime, it's not so easy for black to find meaningful targets. In fact, black tries this move d5 immediately, trying desperately to cut off this bishop from its attack on the king. And after bishop takes d5, we see knight takes d5 and pawn takes d5. Now white has regained the pawn that he was down. Here, black really needed to play a move, rook g8, to get this rook off of this annoying file. Instead though, black tried rook e8. And now after king h3, there's a bishop b6, king takes h4. Like I said, this pawn was always going to fall. Rook d8 is black's choice, aiming for this pawn. However, this move, rook g5, is very, very annoying and actually tactically defends this pawn. I'll let you at home try to find the tactic if rook takes d5. Okay. Okay. That's right, you found it. I'm so proud of you. Rook h5 check, king g8, and knight e7 would be picking up the rook. So rook g5 defends this pawn. King h7 was black's try and renew the threat. However, after rook h5 check, and king g6, and a knight check, and king f6, this knight now comes to c6, a very powerful square. Rook e8, rook e5, rook h8, king g4, black tries a5, and the rest of this game is really just this knight being very, very powerful, and the white piece is kind of ganging up on this black king to prove a winning advantage. Knight e5 check, king g7, rook g5 check. This king has to come to h7 now. Very, very awkward. This rook comes to h5, and then Giri calculated that the minor piece endgame was simply winning after a move knight c4. You don't want to capture this pawn because I'll be able to capture this a pawn. Then after knight c6, I guard all the necessary squares. This king is way too out of play to be relevant. So after king g7, Giri just brings his king closer, king f7, and now the move d6. Forced resignation from Kovalev. Of course, the idea being you can't take because of the bishop, and if the bishop moves, or the king moves, we're simply going to capture and have an extremely winning king and pawn endgame. This one is pretty simple. With that in mind, did Giri refute chess? Maybe not. Maybe Kovalev just needed to be a little bit more careful with his tempi in the opening. Not spending so much time playing moves like king g7, instead advancing on the king's side to meet white's threats on the queen's side with pace. With that in mind, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Game Review. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.